I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and my childhood friend Joe and I were outside every chance we got. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a large forest, and my parents would drop me off in the mornings, and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen, building shelters, setting traps, practicing fire-making with sticks, the whole 9 yards. By the time we got to high school, we got the idea to pull a Stand By Me, based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The plan was to walk the railroad tracks through the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd explore cool bridges to fish from and camp off the tracks. Of course, we knew it was dangerous and likely trespassing, but we were kids. We had a blast. We found beautiful rivers, discovered secluded bridges, fished, and hid from trains. At night, we camped in the woods near the tracks, making small, hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. We enjoyed it so much that we did it multiple times without any problems. After high school, Joe and I went our separate ways. We both left home but stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits when we could. One summer in the mid-90s, we both happened to be in town for about a week. We'd spend time with family during the day, and at night, we'd either grab drinks at a bar or sit around a fire at Joe's house, reminiscing about the old days. One night, we got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia mixed with beer is a powerful thing. We decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp out for a night, and walk home the next day. When the day came, we started early. My wife dropped us off at our old starting spot just outside our hometown. She thought we were crazy and made sure to mention it. As she drove away, Joe suggested we take a different route than usual. How about heading in the opposite direction just to mix things up? We knew the land well and had a map, so I shrugged and said, "Why not?" Off we went. The day was fine. It was fun, but a little bittersweet in that nostalgic way. We found a bridge, sat on the edge, smoked a joint, and kept moving. We didn't bring fishing gear, but we had canned food and supplies. Before night fell, we picked a spot to camp. It's a thickly forested area with trees lining the tracks, making it feel like a tunnel. We had small hammocks to sleep in, but before setting them up, we decided to scout the perimeter. This was something we used to do back in the day, to make sure we weren't accidentally camping in someone's backyard. We walked about 100 feet into the woods and up a small incline. From there, we figured if we didn't see anything, we were good. But when we reached the top, we saw an old building down the hill, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible through the trees. We debated what to do. We assumed it was an old sugar shack or something since there didn't seem to be any roads leading to it. From where we stood, there were no signs of life, no movement, no lights, nothing. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to check it out. As we approached, we realized it wasn't a sugar shack. It was an old church. The building looked like it had been abandoned for years, its wooden planks almost black from moss and rot. A weathered cross still stood on top, and the windows were just open holes with no glass. There were no doors, only open doorways. Peering inside, we saw rows of pews and a raised platform for a preacher. We didn't go all the way in. Something about the place felt wrong. There were no footprints or paths around it, and no roads led there. It was just an abandoned church, seemingly forgotten. Feeling uneasy, we left and climbed back up the hill to our campsite. The hill between us and the church made us feel a bit better, but we were still on edge. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness of stumbling upon an old, decaying church in the woods. As night fell, we set up our hammocks and decided to call it a night, planning to head out first thing in the morning. As we lay there, chatting quietly, we started to hear something coming from the direction of the church. Our conversation went something like this. "Do you hear that?" "Yeah, what is that?" "It sounds like singing?" It really did sound like singing. We both slid out of our hammocks, crouching low to listen more closely. The singing continued, but it wasn't getting any louder. After a minute or two, we decided to sneak back up the hill and see if we could figure out where the sound was coming from. Moving quietly, just like we used to in the old days, we crept up the hill. The moon provided just enough light to navigate without stumbling into trees, so we didn't use our flashlights. When we reached the top, we saw a faint light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was clearly coming from inside. Joe and I exchanged nervous glances. The light looked like candlelight, flickering through the open windows. We tried to make out what was being sung, but it was in another language, something that sounded like church music but unfamiliar. We watched for a while, trying to see who was inside, but all we saw were occasional shadows. Then, the singing stopped, and a booming male voice began to chant. The voice was deep and commanding, and it sent a chill down my spine. It sounded like an old-school preacher, the kind you see in movies, but again, it was in a language we couldn't understand. The preacher would say something, and then a group of voices would respond in song. This went on for a while until they all broke into a long, sustained wail that got louder and louder. It was so unsettling that I had to cover my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I was about to suggest we leave when Joe grabbed my shoulder and whispered, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't see them clearly, but we saw a line of figures emerging from the church, holding hands in a single file. Some of them had flashlights, and they began walking in our direction, singing again. We bolted, grabbing our stuff as quickly and quietly as we could. We ran for the tracks. Once we were back on the tracks, we ran down them in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped to catch our breath and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill, moving erratically as if the people holding them were running too. We kept moving, alternating between running and fast walking, until we reached a road. According to our map, a small town was about 15 minutes down the road. We made it there, found a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come pick us up. When we told our friends and family, most of them thought it was just kids messing around. But those voices didn't sound like any kids I've ever heard. I still don't know who or what those people were, but that night in the woods remains the creepiest experience of my life. This happened when I was growing up around 2004 or 2005, when I was about 13 years old. It took place in a rural area, a good ways outside the town of Uvalde, Texas. The town itself was really small back then, not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that isn't on the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres down outside of that area. They were complaining about a ton of hogs tearing up their land. Since it was open season on hogs in the south, my dad decided to surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to hunt. Not only did that help him network for his job, but it also gave us some quality father and son time. I remember the drive down from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hardtop Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfortable, I hated it. All I could do was either stare out the window or try to beat Super Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy Pocket, something I never managed to do as a kid. The drive took most of the day, so we arrived in the early evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that no one had leased it that year, and the cabin on the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't mind. By that time, I had been in scouts for a couple of years and spent a lot of time in the woods or fishing with friends. Needless to say, I was comfortable roughing it. After unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin, we settled in. The cabin was pretty rough. There's dust and dirt everywhere, flies, and evidence that raccoons had gotten inside and made a mess. After cleaning up a bit and setting up our cots and sleeping bags, we decided to turn in for the night. But something felt strange. I couldn't get comfortable or fall asleep for any real length of time. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Eventually, I drifted off for what felt like maybe an hour. When we woke up, it was early, around 7 a.m. We decided to scout the land for tracks and signs of hogs and find a good place to set up a blind. Since it was summer and brutally hot in the afternoons, morning was the best time to be out. After walking for about an hour, we came to a lightly dense area of trees and, luckily, found some signs of hogs. There's typical torn-up ground where they'd been rooting. We followed the signs into the trees, and I was looking for more when my dad suddenly stopped me with his arm. I looked up and saw someone standing about 50 yards away, partially obscured by the trees. This was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We had confirmation from the owner that no one was around, and the gate had been locked when we arrived. The person was wearing a bright red jacket. We slowly walked toward them, and my dad called out, "Hey, we're hunters. This is private land." The person didn't move at all. They were completely still. We were about 30 yards away and could see that the figure was turned away from us, with hands in their pockets. What struck me as odd was that the person was wearing a ski jacket and pants. It was the middle of summer in Texas, where it was about 98 degrees by then. My dad called out again, but there was no reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnapped the clip on his pistol holster. We only had that since the rifles were back at the cabin. We cautiously approached from the right side, and my dad told me to stay put about 20 yards away. I crouched down, watching as he circled around to the front of the figure, all the while talking to it, asking if they were okay. When he finally got around to the front, my dad suddenly stood up straight with a confused look on his face. I called out, "What's wrong?" And he replied, "It's a mannequin." I walked over to where he was, and as I got closer, one thing really stood out. The clothes on the mannequin were brand new. No dust, no sap, no bird droppings. There's nothing to suggest it had been outside for more than a day. At that moment, I looked at my dad and could see the worry on his face. Almost immediately, I felt that eerie sensation again, like we were being watched, and I could tell my dad felt it too. I wanted to cry. I was suddenly terrified. My dad whispered, "We're leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol, scanning the area the whole way back. I tried my best to hold back tears as we hurried back to the cabin. The walk felt like an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than 45 minutes. As soon as we got back, we packed up and left. We drove home that same day and didn't talk much on the way back. I remember that my dad called his friend, the landowner, right after we left. The owner was confused and said he'd check the property the following week when he was in the area. He also mentioned that he'd never had problems with people on the land before since the property was high-fenced. My dad isn't usually a paranoid person, but with me being young and the possibility of someone else being on the lease, he decided it was best to be cautious and leave. When we got home, we talked, and my dad admitted that he hadn't slept well the night before either. He'd had the same uneasy feeling, but didn't want to wake me up since he thought I was asleep. A week later, his friend called back to say he had checked the entire property and found no trace of anyone. There was no mannequin, no nothing. That story still gives me chills. I have no idea what was really going on, but the paranoid part of me thinks it might have been some kind of trap or something. This incident took place about 5 years ago on an overnight trip into the Superstition Mountains, which are about an hour's drive east of Phoenix. I'm not going to specify the exact trail because I've been doing this long enough to know what happens when you post stuff on the internet. Whether it's a good trail, abandoned mine, ghosts, or whatever it may be, people come flocking, often bringing trash and loud music. Anyway, this particular trail was an 8-mile loop through a canyon, a pretty simple in-and-out overnight trip. I had planned to go with my friend, but a last-minute cancel on his part left me on my own. With my bag packed and my car ready, I decided to go solo. Unfortunately, I didn't leave the house on time, and some trouble navigating rough forest roads meant I didn't arrive at the trailhead until around 5:45 p.m. For those who don't backpack, this is a big no-no. I had about a 4-mile hike to reach my planned camping spot, and it was getting dark fast. I figured if I moved quickly, I could cover 2 to 3 miles before I had to find a spot. This strategy left me hiking a very dark trail alone, with about 15 miles of dirt road between me and anyone else. Hiking in the dark is scary, especially in a remote area like this, and being on my own didn't help. Eventually, it got so dark that I could only see where my headlamp was pointing. I realized I needed to stop and set up camp. Using just my headlamp as my light source and trying to move fast, I ended up in a less than ideal spot. However, there were some burnt pieces of wood and the remains of a fire circle, so it looked like people had been there before, though not recently. My first priority was to get a fire going. I scanned the area around me, found some dry wood, and got the fire started. After that, I set up my tarp and cracked open a can of chili mac that I'd brought. I was looking forward to eating it. I started feeling good. My camp was set up and my food was on the fire. The uneasiness from the hike had mostly gone away, though it was still there, a side effect of camping alone in remote areas. To fully understand what happened next, I have to explain how my camp was set up. The site I picked was a small clearing surrounded by large pine trees, with the trail about 30 feet to my left. When you're in the woods with a fire going, the fire casts a circle of light around it, and everything beyond the edge of that circle is pitch black. I was sitting on the ground near my fire, eating dinner, when a small rock about the size of a marble was thrown into my camp. I stared at the rock in shock, positive I was the only person on this trail that night. I immediately turned my light towards the area where the rock had come from, but due to the density of the pines and brush, I could only see about 10 feet ahead. For the next 15 minutes, I sat in disbelief. After a while, I convinced myself that I must have kicked the rock or it had fallen from a tree. I went to sleep that night, not expecting the pure terror that was about to unfold. I woke up to the sound of rustling leaves, barely audible unless you were listening for it. At first, I thought I imagined it, but as the rustling grew fainter, I realized it was moving away from me. Groggily, I reached for the handheld flashlight I'd left next to me when I fell asleep, but the more I searched, the more frightened I became. It wasn't there. I stood up in my sleeping bag, ducked out from under my tarp, and looked around. That's when I saw it. My flashlight, lying on the ground in a pile of leaves about 15 feet away. This is one of the few moments in my life when I was truly terrified. The flashlight, which I had left right next to me, was now outside in the woods. I hurriedly slipped on my boots, clutching my knife in one hand while keeping my head on a swivel. I weighed my options: stay here and wait out the night or attempt the 3-mile hike back to the car in the dark. I figured that whatever or whoever was out there would have the upper hand if I was out on the trail without light, so I decided to stay put and wait until morning. Eventually, I heard it again, the sound of someone walking through the woods. It was faint and far off, like someone strolling leisurely without a care in the world. The footsteps would fade for a while, then return an hour or two later, as faint as ever. This went on for 3 or 4 hours. Then, the footsteps grew closer, about 7 feet away. By this point, my fire had nearly burned out, and I had no more wood. The footsteps stopped, and everything went completely silent. I sat there, still as a statue, clutching my knife and praying I wouldn't hear anything else. I stayed like that for 2 hours until the sun finally rose, casting enough light for me to see that I was alone. I packed my things quickly and speed-walked the 3 miles back down the trail. When I reached the empty dirt road where my car was parked, I nearly sprinted to it. I unlocked my Subaru, jumped in, and didn't stop driving until I was at least 20 miles away. I stopped at a gas station in Apache Junction to buy a Red Bull, but mostly just to see or talk to another person. As I exited the store, I noticed something written in the dust on the back window of my car. Sleep well. A lot of weird things have happened to me on my various adventures through Arizona, but this was by far the weirdest and scariest. I thought I'd share it. There is a seriously deranged person living in the Superstition Mountains. Do yourself a favor and stay as far away from those mountains as you can. I was homeless for a few years from 18 to 21, and I used to stay in a tent with my ex. I always had to end up moving my tent spot eventually because the cops would find us. Either way, I spent a lot of time in the woods at night. One night, while walking back to my tent, I heard something down the trail. I shined my light in the direction of the sound and was met with glowing eyes reflecting back at me. The strange part was that whatever I was looking at was taller than me, and I'm 5 feet 8 inches. There's no animal that tall in my area. I turned to my ex and told him to head to the tent faster. He could tell something was off and asked if I was all right. I told him I'd explain when we got to the tent because I've always been told not to acknowledge creatures or spirits, as it gives them more power. On some nights, there would be smacking sounds on our tent. It would hit all sides of the tent. We'd look out the windows and check around the tent, but never found anything or heard any footsteps. Another night, during the summer, we decided to go for a short hike at night because the temperature was more tolerable. About 15 minutes into the hike, I started feeling paranoid, like I was being watched. Around 5 minutes later, I heard a maniacal laugh coming from somewhere in the woods, but I couldn't pinpoint the direction. My ex asked, "What was that?" And I said loudly, "I don't know, but whatever it is needs to stop." As soon as I said this, multiple maniacal laughs started. My ex and I turned around and walked back, and it felt like the longest 20 minutes ever. Another time, I found a severed coyote head with something hanging in the tree beside it, which had a tooth inside. Lastly, I was with my friend, parked on a road deep in the woods so we could smoke. The passenger window where I was sitting was down, and the woods were right next to me. The feeling of being watched overwhelmed me again. A couple of minutes later, I heard a voice say, "Hello," and then "John?" coming from the woods. I told my friend to turn around and that we needed to leave. I didn't tell her why because, like I said, I don't like to acknowledge these things until I'm far away from them.